Today we're going to be learning Shekalim Daf Vav. This is the Daf for Shabbat, Erev Pesach. Finally, we've gotten to Yudalet Shechaliyot Shabbat that we've been learning about for a very long time. Okay, we're going to start from the beginning of the page. In Shekalim Halacha Gimel. We're into the second chapter, third Mishnah. If you collect money and you say these are going for my half shekel. What if I collect this money and I added too much money and now I have more than a half a shekel? What happens to the extra? They go to nidava. Okay, that is offerings given on the altar, as we've been seeing, for voluntary offerings called the Ketz HaMizbeach. They're burnt offerings that get burnt on the altar when nothing else is happening there. He says it's the opposite. No, whatever's left is chulin. What Beit Shammai basically says is you made it hekdesh, even by mistake, that's considered hekdesh, sanctified items. But Beit Hillel says it was just a mistake. You never meant to sanctify them. You obviously only wanted half a shekel. You just didn't realize how much money you had put there. It seems we're going to see from the Gemara later, they assume that they're discussing a case where somebody puts a little money and a little money. They don't have a lot of money. So they keep putting some pennies aside, keep putting a little money, and eventually it collects to a half shekel. If they went over, they obviously didn't mean to put that much in. What if you say, Sha'avi mehen shikli? I'm putting these all in a pile and I will bring from here my machatzira shekel. Now, if you say it specifically like that, you obviously didn't mean that once you get over half shekel, it's going to be sanctified. So therefore, everyone agrees, Shavim, they both agree, Shamotar chulin, that whatever's left is chulin. Elu lachatati, what if you say these are for my sacrifice, my sin offering? Now, this is different. We'll see how is it different from shekalim. These are from, so the same case as the first case. Now you say, I'm putting money aside a little bit, and then it turns out you bought an animal for less money. Shavin shamotar nedavat. Everybody agrees in that case, whatever's left goes to a voluntary offering. Shavi mehen chatati, but if you say, I'm bringing from here my chatat, then they'll all agree, shavin shamotar chulin, just like that's similar to the shekalim case. From here is going to mean only some of it. Amar Rabbi Shimon. What's the difference between them? He says, now we're really talking about the beginning part, right? Why is there a difference between chatat and shlamim? That hare elu l'shikli, Beit Hillel is going to say motaran chulin, and here he says in the chatat case, everyone says motaran is nidava when you put a little bit at a time. So what's the difference? Because shkalim, elishal shkalim yesh lein kitzba lechatat in kitzba. There's a set amount. You were only putting aside a half a shekel. When it came to money for an animal, you have no idea what the animal is going to cost. So you might have put the money in there, intending it to be for the chatat. In the end, you found a cheaper price. That's a different story. Kishalu Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af l'shkalim lein lein kitzba. He says, what do you mean? Shkalim don't have kitzba either. Now this seems strange. What do you mean? You give a half shekel. Well, he's going to give you a little history. When they came from the galut, from the exile, and they came back to Israel, hayu shoklim darkonot. The currency used then was a darkon. A darkon is worth 2 shekels. Well, we'll see later. There's a bit of a debate about it, maybe 1.5. So they used something that was more than a half a shekel, and they would take a half a shekel of that, a half of a darkon, which is more money. Chazru lishkol slaim. Over time, then the currency became slaim, which is the same as a shekel. So they would take a half a selah, which is the same as half a shekel. Chazru lishkol tva'im. Then the currency changed to tva'im, which are worth half the amount of a selah, half the amount of a shekel. Then they would take the whole coin and not half of it, because we don't want to go under. We'll see that in a minute. Bikshu lishkol dinarim. Then they wanted to use dinarim of kesef. There's dinarim of zahav and dinarim of kesef, silver. These are silver ones. And then that was worth half a taba. Now here, if you took half a dinar, that's going to be worth, or a whole dinar is only worth a quarter of a shekel because it's worth half of a taba'ah, which is half a shekel. Below kiblumehem, but they wouldn't accept it because that was only a quarter of a shekel. You can't go under. You can do more, but you can't go under. Now, what do you see here? Over time, the value changed. So it's not like shekalim having an exact set amount. So what's Rabbi Shimon's obvious response? Rabbi Shimon, yad kulan shaveh. It's true it changed over time, but everybody gives the exact same amount. Whatever time you're living in, you're going to give whatever the currency is that people are giving and the amount that they're giving. And therefore, clearly, if I put a little bit aside and I went over, I didn't mean to go over. Aval chatat, but when it comes to a chatat, zemibi b'selav, zemibi b'shtayim, zemibi b'shalosh, you could buy animals of all different amounts, and therefore, we're going to assume that all my money is sanctified. Starts the Gemara, hamechanes. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Elazar says, Ma pligan. What's their machloket? Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. B'mechanes protrot. It's like I said. They put a little bit. Aval b'omer elu l'shikli. But if you put a whole stack of money, you take a big amount of coins and you put it all in a box, put it aside, and you say, this is for my shekel. Kol amamode shamotar nedava. Everybody agrees. You knew what you were doing in this case. You knew you were taking more because you did it all at once. It's not like it was over a period of time. And therefore, everything's going to be sanctified. Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Biva, B'Shem Rabbi Elazar is going to say the opposite. The beginning is the same. Ma pligin b'mechanes protot. It's really when you put a little bit at a time. That's the machlok. Aval b'omer elu l'shekli. But if you take a whole big stack and you put it all at once, kol hamamodeh shamot chulin. Then everyone's going to agree whatever's extra is chulin because you took a whole amount. You didn't realize how much you put in, and you obviously didn't mean to put in more than a shekel. So therefore, the extra is going to be chulin. Amar Rabbi Chia. Matniti Masayah Rabbi Bevi. The Mishnah, our Mishnah supports Rabbi Bevi. Why? Why are we going to assume that it's all going to be chulin? Because what did we say? Rabbi Shimon said, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Ma ben shkalim lechatat, ela shkalim yesh len kitzba, lechatat en la kitzba. And that's going to explain why you thought the extra all goes to chulin. Because you clearly didn't mean for it to be more than half a shekel, even if you took this big amount, because the extra is going to be chulin. So therefore, ela shkalim yesh len kitzba, ulechatat en la kitzba. So therefore, that line is coming to explain why shkalim are all going to go to chulin different than a chatat, because if you put them all in at once, you clearly didn't mean for more because shkalim have a set amount. So now they say ma'an and kayamim. Sorry, I think I skipped a line. Ma'an and kayamim. So here they're going to explain. Im be'omer. So now they're going to explain why this is their proof. Now, when they say shkalim yesh len kitzba lechatat en kitzba, what are they referring to? It can't be mevi mehen shikli because that already we said it's the exact same thing. If I'm going to bring from here, we already explained kol amamode shamot chulin. Everybody said that the extra is chulin. In other words, and that's the case for chatat and for shkalim. There's no difference. Im ba'omer shavi mehen chatati. If it's the case where I say I'm going to bring from here my chatat, kol amamode shamot chulin. Right? That's all. Again, there's going to be no difference. Both of those are chulin, shkalim, and chulin. Ela kan anan kaimin. So what must be the case? Be'omer hare elu l'shikli. It must be when you said these are for my shekel, and the assumption is you put them all at once. Shkalim al yidei shekatzpatam min haTorah motaran chulin, and chatat al yidei she'en katzpatam min haTorah motaran nedavat. This is basically what I said before. That's the case where we're going to see a difference between the two. So now they're going to say, "My avid le Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Elazar." So what's Rabbi Yossi and the name of Rabbi Elazar? What's he going to say? How does he explain that line? So they say very simply, and this is how we explained it in the first place when we read the Mishnah. He explains it in the case where you did a little bit at a time and according to Beit Hillel. Because again, Beit Hillel says, and we have to find where there's a difference between the two cases. If you say that you put a whole stack at once, then there's two ways of doing it, avi mehen or avi l'shikli. And then you'd have to say, if that's the case where there's a difference, you'd have to say, that's where Beit Hillel said, that's where Rabbi Shimon said, shkalim is nedava, is chulin, and the chatat is nedava. But there's another, you don't have to say it's specifically that case. That was all to explain the first approach, the second approach of Rabbi Bivi. But now we're going to say we can also explain it according to Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi can say, no, he was referring to the case of the first case in the Mishnah where mechanes protrot, you put a little bit at a time, and there Beit Hillel, and if now Beit Shammai is going to say no matter what, it's nedava both in chatat and in shkalim. So you have to find a case where there's a difference between the two, and that's what Rabbi Shimon's coming to explain. But according to Beit Hillel, there's a difference. So you say that Rabbi Shimon is really only making a statement according to Beit Hillel, and in the case where you put a little bit at a time. So we've explained it if it's referring to the case where you put them all in at once, and we explained it only according to Rabbi Bivi, and we explained it according to if it's the case where you put a little bit at a time, then we can explain according to Beit Hillel, and that explains Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Elazar. Okay, next. Okay, Vahatanina. Now wait, but there's another problem with Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Elazar. That's Nina, and it says in the upcoming Mishnah, motar shkalim chulin. It says the extra shkalim are chulin. Now again, why is this a problem, right? Because Beit Shammai thinks it's not. So what do we say very simply, right? Beit Shammai says, if you say Harei Elu Shekli, that's motal, motaran nidava. So they say very simply, Pachala, the next mission is B'machanes portot ukibeit Hillel. It must be if you put a little bit at a time, and according to Beit Hillel, and it just doesn't match Beit Shammai's opinion. We're going to skip the parentheses, okay? Like I said, there's a lot of Girsa problems in general here. And let's move on. Hamafrish shiklo. You separate your shekel. V'savar shu chayav. You thought you had to pay a machatzit shekel. V'nimtza she'eno chayav. Turns out maybe you already gave it. You forgot that you gave it. Lo kidesh. You're not. It doesn't become sanctified, right? This happens many times. I go to pay for something and I forgot that I already took care of it. Hamafrish shnayim v'savar shu chayav shnayim. If I separated two and I thought I was obligated two, then now why would I be obligated 2 half shekels? Aren't we only obligated 1? But if I forgot to do it last year, then I have to do 2 this year. So let's say I thought I forgot. But it turns out I actually had given last year. I don't need to bring another one. So what do we do with the second one? So now, if I'm not obligated at all, then it was just a mistake. And it goes back to being regular chulin. But if, right, chulin is not sanctified. But if I separated 2, I was obligated 1, but I separated 2, maybe that second one might be sanctified. Let's see. So nishme'ina min hada, let's learn it from here. He separated his chatat. He thought he was obligated, and it turns out he wasn't. Now this is a chatat. This isn't a shkalim. Right now they're going to compare chatat and shkalim, even though before we suggested there was a difference. But let's see. If that's the case, lo kitsha. So again, the same thing. If I'm not obligated at all, and I took an animal for a sin offering, and I wasn't obligated to sin offering, it's nothing. But hifrish shtayim, v'savar shu chayav shtayim, v'nimsa she'eno chayav el echad. But if I took 2, and I thought I was obligated to, but it turns out I was only obligated 1, but I was obligated 1. Ota shniya mayat avidle. What are you supposed to do with it? Ela ro'eh. You can't do anything with it because it was sanctified. All you can do is leave it to graze until it gets a blemish. Then you can sell it and buy with it another animal. But right, you can sell it off and then you can use the money. But hachanami, so now, and then when you buy another animal, you bring it as a sacrifice because this was sanctified. Has to be brought as a sacrifice since you can't because it's not for anyone's sin offering. So you have to wait, let it graze, and then it becomes a nidava. You use that animal for a voluntary offering. So hachanami elu nidava. So they say it would be the same exact thing with the shekel. To which the Gemara answers, how could you compare the two? Didn't we already say in the Mishnah, there's a difference between the two. One has a set amount, one doesn't. That makes all the difference. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So now we're going back to Rabbi Yehuda, and he talked about the difference in the value of the currencies. And here we get a bit of a lesson in currencies. Darkonot dinarim. Okay, darkonot are the same amount as gold dinarim, not silver ones. They're worth 2 shekels each. Chazru lishkol slaim, then they changed to slaim. Kishmuan, sela, everybody knows what a sela is now. You might not, but now you do, but to them it was obvious. Chazru lishkol tvaim, what's that? Palge slaim, you see which currencies they were familiar with and which they weren't, because the ones that they were familiar with, they don't describe. The ones they weren't, they have to explain. Bikshu lishkol dinarim, what's that? Chatin. That's the coin that they knew as a chatin. It's worth, like we said, half of a taba'ah. V'lo kiblu alehen, but they didn't accept it. Why not? Minhada, they learned from this pasuk in Nehemiah. V'hamidenu alenu mitzvot latet shlishit hashekel. Okay, they put mitzvot upon us to give a third of a shekel. This is a little bit weird where we get to a third. I'll talk about in a minute. Bishana, once a year, la'avodat beit Elokeinu, for the worship in the house of God. So now, shlishit hashekel, they assume one explanation is it was talking about darkonot, because we said when they got back from the exile, they brought darkonot. Now, darkon, if you say it's 1.5 shekalim, the value, then it makes sense to say a third is a half a shekel. That's perfect. Some people say it was 2 shekalim, 2/3, right? They would take a third of that, which is more, right? So it's 2/3 of it's a third of 2 shekels. So that's going to be, right? It's going to be more than half a shekel, but at least it's more than half a shekel, right? And there you see again, the value is different. It changed over time. Okay, now, Rabbi Chilkiah b'shem Rabbi Acha says, "Mikan shad tzarich adam l'shalesh shiklo shlosha pamim b'shana." From here you learn that you need to give a third of, you need to give your shekel. Okay, what they seem to mean here is you should give tzedakah 3 times a year. Okay, one should give tzedakah at 3 points in the year because they learn it from shlishit hashekel b'shana. So they take this shlishit, they learn from here things about threes. You should give 3 times a year. There's a debate about what exactly it means with shalesh sheklo, because don't we give it once a year? But there's also trumat alishka. We'll see that in the upcoming Mishnah 3 times a year. Anyway, a bit of a debate about what that means. You shouldn't make a tzedakah appeal more than 3 times a year. I don't know if this means for one charity or for multiple charities. We all know that we're asked to give money for many, many times a year for all sorts of things, but maybe it means like if a shul has an appeal, you shouldn't do it more than 3 times a year or something like that. From here we learn they would collect it. There would be 3 sa'im per box, where they would collect all the machatziyot shekel. There were 3 kupot, so they would have 3 kupot of 3 sa'im each. And mikan l'shalosh hafrashot, there were 3 times a year where they separated the money. We're going to get to that, as I said, in the upcoming Mishnah and tomorrow's stuff. Okay. Next, ktiv. Now we're talking about the verse that talks about giving a machatzira shekel. It says in the Torah in Parshat Ki Tisa that you're supposed to give half a shekel. Now, that parsha is mentioned just before the Chet HaEgel happens, the sin of the golden calf. There's a whole debate among the commentaries. Did the sin of the golden calf happen before or did it happen after? And it's a bit of a problem because the sin of the golden calf splits between the commandment to build the tabernacle and the Mishkan and the commandment and the actual building of it. Some people say it's out of order and really the whole thing happened after. And the Mishkan is a reaction to Chet HaEgel. Because we sin with the golden calf, we showed we needed some physical place of God to be, and therefore we were given the Mishkan. And the fact that it appears before, it doesn't matter because the Torah is not chronological. Some people say it happened chronologically, and Chet HaEgel happened after they already had the commandment for the Mishkan. And then the commandment for the machatzira shekel happens before Chet HaEgel. Now this Gemara assumes, at least some of the opinions, that it happened after and that there's no real order and that this happened at the beginning of the parsha, but it really happened, it appears at the beginning of the parsha, but it really happened after. And we'll see why in a minute. The machatzira shekel is a reaction to the sin of the golden calf. So now they say, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia, Charamar, one of them said, they sinned at half day, therefore they gave half a shekel, because at half day they realized Moshe wasn't coming down, and that's when they built the golden calf. He says we're supposed to give 6 garmesim, which is the value of a half shekel, which corresponds to the 6 hours, which is the same thing as half a day. It's just, it comes to the number in a different way. 6 garmesim is the amount because of the 6 hours that they gave. It was in 6 hours that it happened. Rabbi Yeshua Rabbi Nechemia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lefisha avru al aseret hadibrot, because they went against the 10 commandments by going against God, not believing in God, even though it's not all the 10 commandments, but it's like it's the beginning of the 10 commandments, and all of them are based on that basically. So they have to give 10 gera, which is half a shekel. 20 gera, 20 gera is 1 whole shekel. We're learning a lot about currencies today. And because they went against the 10 commandments, so they have to give 10. Rabbi Brechia, Rabbi Levi, B'Shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, I am keeping adding the word said because it doesn't say it in Hebrew. This is just interesting the way things are worded here. There seem to be maybe words missing, or it's just the way they spoke. Again, we see that the Yerushalmi has a very different dialect than we saw before, different style. Lefisha machro b'chora shel Rachel b'20 kesef. Yehei kol echad ve'echad podeh b'no b'choro b'20 kesef. We're now a little bit off on a tangent because we're going to get back to the sale of Yosef and how it connects to the half shekel. But they're going to say now they sold Yosef for 20 gera. Because they sold him for 20 gera, therefore everybody has to redeem their son for 20 gera. It's the amount of pidyon ben, what you do if you have a firstborn son. He needs a pidyon ben unless the parents are Kohanim or Leviim, one of the parents. And therefore, you redeem the son with the same amount. It's connected to the sale of Yosef. How much is that? We call it 5 slaim because 5 slaim is 20 gera. Okay, Rabbi Pinchas, b'shem Rabbi Levi, lefisha machro b'chora shel Rachel b'20 kesef, v'nafal l'chol echad ve'echad mehem tib'ah. Because they sold for esrim kesef. Okay, this isn't, I might have said by accident, gerah. It's kesef, it's something else, it's a different currency. Because they sold them for esrim kesef, okay, 20 kesef, which is equal, as we saw, 20 kesef to 5 slaim, okay, which is also 5 shkalim. So, and everyone got it tiv'ah because, okay, let's do the math. 20 kesef, 5 shkalim we said is 10 taba'im because each tabah is half a shekel. So therefore, it's the amount that everybody got from the sale. Everybody got 1 tiv'ah. Therefore, right, who's everybody? It's the 10 brothers. Which 10 brothers? Interesting machloket about this. You would assume who wasn't there? Yosef and Binyamin, right? Obvious. Joseph, Benjamin. They were the two. Joseph got sold and Benjamin wasn't there. But interestingly, the Tachlin Chadatin says that, you look at the very last line, he says, "V'nafal l'chol echad v'echad min ha'achim shayu 10, sheReuven uBinyamin lo hayu b'mechira." Reuven and Binyamin weren't there. Because remember, Reuven leaves. He doesn't like what they did to Yosef and he disagrees with them a little bit and he just walks away, leaves the scene. So now you have to wonder, well, okay, maybe so, but who's the 10th then? If Yosef wasn't there, he doesn't count. But they actually say, Yosef he gets put in the count because it was his fault. He caused this whole problem. He's responsible, okay? Because they held him responsible, which is really interesting. And even so, right, they even come up with this amount that is if there were 10 there. Okay, new Mishnah. Motar shkalim chulin. This we may mention of before. We're going to see this later. That this was the Mishnah. We said it must be talking about Beit Hillel and Protrot, because Beit Shammai thinks if you do it in bit by bit, it is going to be sanctified and it's going to go to Nidava, but this says it goes to chulin. Motar chasarit efa, 10th of an efa, that's a measurement, a volume measurement of they use the flour for the mincha offering. It's used for 2 mincha offerings, this amount. One for the mincha of a sinner who can't afford a more expensive sacrifice, so he brings a meal offering. And one is for the Kohen Gadol, had to do twice a day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. So both of them need a 10th of an efa. So it's not clear which one we're referring to. We'll wait till the Gemara might clarify. But at this point, maybe let's assume it's talking about both. It doesn't say what the halacha is, and there's a bit of a girsa problem here. Many people think that it connects with the end of we'll see in a minute, the end of the next line, and it's just one in that list. There's a bit of a problem with saying that. But if we say that, then we'll get to the conclusion that it's nidavas. Some people actually have a girsa that says, their version says, hasivit haifa should be chulin. Okay, whatever's left of it. This actually sounds a little like the shkalim because it has a set amount. Motal kanei zavim, kanei zavot, kinei yodot, chataot v'ashamot, motara nidava. If you have left over from the pair of birds, you put money aside for a pair of birds for a zava or a zav or a yoledet, someone who gives birth. They all have to bring these pairs of animals, which one is an olah, one is a chatat, one is a burnt offering, one is a sin offering. Chataot and ashamot, okay, sin offerings and guilt offerings. Motara nidava. Now, the Gemara says, zehaklal, this is the rule. And this is why it's a little tricky to say asirit haifa goes with these, even though that really does seem to be the way most people read this. Because it says, kol shu ba l'shem chatat u'mishum ashma motara nidava. Anything that comes because of a sin or because of guilt, its extras are going to be nidava. Now, why is that an issue? Well, the asirit haifa of the Kohen Gadol isn't something that's because of a sin. However, the minchat chotei, the one for a sinner, is a sin. So if you say it's that, it makes more sense. Motar ola la'ola, motar mincha lemincha, motar shlamim l'shlamim. You have an extra ola, it goes for an ola offering. If I set aside money to bring a burnt offering, a voluntary burnt offering, and I have leftovers, so it goes to the next time I bring a burnt offering. If I have a mincha, a voluntary mincha, extra goes to a mincha. If I had extra for my shlam, it goes to a shlam. Motar pesach l'shlamim. If I have extra for my pesach, it goes to shlamim. This we also saw in Masechet Pesachim, that if and let's say even took an animal, it's not just leftover money, but I have an animal left over that I didn't use for my korban pesach, that I designated for my korban pesach, it automatically becomes a shlamim, a peace offering, because a pesach is a type of peace offering. So because of that, it goes into a peace offering, because it won't be valid for the next year because it has to be within its first year to use for pesach. What about before pesach? We'll get into that. What if you separate your animal for pesach, and then you say, I'm sacrificing it as a shlamim, before Pesach, when you're not obligated in the Korban Pesach yet, if it's not the 14th in the afternoon. So then you would do it as a shlamim also. Okay, we'll get into that a little bit more today. And we saw it a lot in Masechet Pesachim if you were with us for Pesachim. Motar nazir l'nazirim. If There's money the community puts aside for Nazirim, for their sacrifices. And Nazir has to bring 3 sacrifices. We'll get into that more tomorrow. The extra goes to other Nazirim. Motar Nazir lenidava. Leftovers of a particular Nazir, if I separate it for myself, anything left over goes to Nidava. We're going to have a discussion about that tomorrow. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Ad Anan Taman, until I was there, meaning once I was in Bavel, Shamat Kal Rabbi Yehuda Sha'al Shmuel. I heard Rabbi Yehuda ask Shmuel, Hiflish Shiklo V'Meit. What happens if someone designates a shekel and then they die? What happens to that half shekel? Amar Le Yiplu L'Nidava. It goes to a voluntary offering. Motar. Now this seems different from what we said. Motar Shekalim. It's not the same as Motar Shekalim. Motar Shekalim is extra that's left over. That's different because I obviously didn't mean to put that much money aside. But if I already separated it, then it's sanctified and then it goes to Nedava. That makes a lot of sense. Motar Siridai Fasha. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yolechem Liyam HaMelech. It has to be brought to Yam HaMelech. There's nothing, things that there's nothing you can do with. They have to just be left to rot or something. If it's money doesn't really rot. So you put it in the Dead Sea and there it disintegrates. Rabbi Lazar Amar Yiplu L'Nedava. Rabbi Lazar says, no, you leave it for a voluntary offering. Matnita pliga Rabbi Yochanan. Our Mishnah must go against Rabbi Yochanan because our Mishnah says motar shkalim chulin, motar shkalim or chulin. Okay, this isn't important yet, but asirit haifa is important. Motar asirit haifa, motar kinei zavim, v'kinei zavot, motar kinei oldot, chatot vashamot, motar nidava. So what do you see here? This is assuming the reading that we saw that I mentioned that motar asirit haifa goes to nidava as it appears in ours, right? That's the version they had. So how can you say that it goes to Yam HaMelech when it says here it goes to voluntary offering? My Avidla Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with this? Patarla, he explains it this way. Motar siridai fasham menchat chotei shel kol Yisrael. He says that's talking about a menchat chotei of all Yisrael, and I was talking here about the menchat chotei, the menchat chavitin of the Kohen Gadol. In other words, now we're going to say, as I mentioned before, it was a bit of a question. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the Mishnah is talking about the sin offering, which then makes sense that it's mixed together with all those sin offerings. And this one that Rabbi Yochanan is talking about, that goes to Yam HaMelech, is the Kohen Gadol's one. Rabbi Yossi Amar, Alda Alil Abba Barba Di'in. Okay, on this issue, I disagree with, on this issue, Abba Barba disagrees with the rabbis. Di'inu Namrim, they say, what issue? The issue we're going to say right now, not in the past, we're now going forward. Pesach mishaneh l'shem shlamim. They say, how do we know that a Pesach can become a shlamim? Talmud Lamar, it says in the verse, Ve'im minatzon korbanot lezevach shlamim, kol shu minatzon ba shlamim. So anything that comes from tzon can be brought as a shlamim. That's where we get it from. Okay? The Pesach automatically goes to become a shlamim because the pasuk about a korban shlamim says, Im min hatzon korbanot. If you bring your korban shlamim from the tzon, and they seem to say there's something extra here, it's coming to tell you, we'll see soon how we get it. Anything that comes from the tzon, that there's something additional that comes from the tzon, from sheep and goats, that is brought as a shlamim. What is that? That's the Pesach. Because Pesach comes from kvasim or izim, from sheep or lambs or goats. So now they question this. Hativon is like a lashon of a question, a language of a question, like meitive or eitive. It's the same root. Hare ola min hatzon. Also, an ola can be brought from its own. So why can't you say an ola can be brought as a shlamim? We only say a Pesach goes into a shlamim, but not an ola. So they say, davar she'eino ba ela min hatzon. It's only something that comes only from its own, which is Pesach. But yatsa ola shiba afilu min makar. Ola also comes from cattle. So that's why it's not included in this minatzon. Minatzon means only things. It's going to include only things that come only from tzon. So hativon arei asham. And asham is brought from kvasim or elim, which is basically the same animal, but at a different age. It's called something at a different age. That's in the category of tzon. And Amar Rabbi Bun bar Kahana, minatzon davar shuba mikol hatzon. He says, no. Minatzon only comes to include something that can come from any type of tzon, which includes also goats. But yatsa asham shenoba elamina elim bilvad. It only comes from elim or kvasim, which again, as I told you, it's the same animal. That's why they only use one word for it. But it can only come from there because that's the because it's only the Pesach, which is all tzon, as opposed to asham, which is only some tzon. To which they say, bechol atar At amart min lema'et, v'kanat amar min lerabot. But wait a minute. Everywhere you say min is to limit, and here you say min is to include. Min always is a limiting term. It means only some of. Amar Rabbi Mana, hachanami min lema'et. Really, min is lema'et here. What is it mema'et? What does it limit? Well, it's a mi'ut she'eno ba ben shtei shanim, mi'ut she'eno ba nikeva. There's two limitations to the Pesach. It can't come from all tzon. It comes only from ones that are within their first year and only ones that are male, not female. So it is limiting. And then the assumption is you'd have to say, it doesn't really spell this out, but where do they get it from then? Hot zone, that zone, that comes to include. It's not from the word min. Min is limiting. It's actually something that only comes from sunstone. Sunstone is age range and sex of the animal, but not which types. It includes all types of tzon, and hot tzon comes to say anything that comes from all types of tzon can be brought as a shlamim, and what's that? That's a Pesach. But then they say, it's a little bit unclear what this term is, what this line is coming to say. It sounds like it's saying that in Asham, if you just had min, then it would have limited, then you would have included. And it has to have hot zone that comes to include the Pesach. Otherwise, you would have said min limits, and maybe it limits to something that's limited to only kvasim or elim, which would include the asham, and therefore it's clear from here that it must be the hay which is including and not the mem, because the mem could, if it was on its own, it would have included specifically also the asham. Hativon, another question. V'aktiv im min atzon korbano min akvasim o min ezim la'ola. Also by the korban ola, it has the same phraseology. If from tzon, if you're going to bring it from those kind of animals, it also happens to say, right, well, whatever. Let's just leave it at this. There it specifies exactly which tzon. So maybe you should say korban pesach me'ata motar pesach ba'ola. You want to say from here. If you use that drasha, also there you use the same thing and say maybe a motar pesach, leftover pesach will become an ola. So Amar Rabbi Avun mishanin davar shu la'achila ledavar shu la'achila ve'em mishanin davar shu la'achila ledavar she'eno la'achila. We're going to compare like items to like items and not different items. A burnt offering gets burnt entirely. Both a shlamim and a pesach get eaten, and therefore we're going to compare the shlamim to we're going to learn the pesach becomes a shlamim, but not an ola. Amar Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Bun mishanin kodshim kalim l'shem kodshim kalim ve'em mishanin kodshim kalim l'shem kodshim kodshim. We learn from kodshim kalim to kodshim kalim, and we don't learn from kodshim kodshim to kodshim kalim. Kodshim kalim to kodshim kodshim. In other words, we're going to learn from, again, Pesach's going to become a shlamim. It's not going to become an ola because that's in a different category. That's high level sanctity. And shlamim and Pesach are low level sanctity. Again, what does it mean they're low level sanctity? They're low level sanctity because they only come, because they're eaten by the owners. Okay. 1 second. Yeah, there's a bit of a question. We started this section with Alda Aliyal Abba Bar Abba. Okay, which we said on this he disagrees, and they don't really point out what he disagrees. So if you look at the Korban Ha'eda, the commentary on the side, he says it's talking about something later which says Hikshe Avua de Shmuel, which is Abba Bar Abba. In other words, I'm just trying to find it because I only realized now as I was reading it that I didn't realize where he doesn't really come in here. I'm not sure where Shmuel comes in, but there must be some. There's obviously some complicated issue here as to what it's talking about. Yeah, so Alda. Yeah, I'm just trying to see where Avav per Shmuel. Okay, it's a question. There's obviously some question about this, where this comes up, where his question is. It's Avua de Shmuel somewhere. Didn't see it in this section, so it's a little bit Avua de Shmuel. It must be coming. I know where it is. It's coming later on in the sugya. There's this question. Hopefully we'll get to it as we go on in the daf, because it's a bit of a question here where Avua de Shmuel comes in. Okay, I don't believe that we saw him yet. Okay, let's move on. Amar Rabbi Abu, no, skip that. We're done with that. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan Amar. So now Rabbi Yochanan comes in and he says, Alda aliyah Rabbi Chanina. On the following thing, Rabbi Chanina disagrees with the rabbis. Di'inun Amrin, he says, they say, the rabbis say, Ein Pesach mishtaneh l'shem shlamim. Ele im ken shachato l'shem shlamim. Okay, the Pesach doesn't switch to a shlamim unless you slaughtered it for a shlamim. Okay, now, again, what did I tell you? Pesach, after Pesach, automatically becomes a shlamim. Well, we're talking about, let's say, I'm standing on the 10th of Nisan, and I take a sacrifice, my animal that I designate for Pesach, and I slaughter it regular. Now, if I slaughter it according to the rabbis, only if I slaughter it in the name of shlamim does it become shlamim. Vani omer, but Rabbi Hanina disagrees and says, shachato l'shem, afilu shachato l'shem olah. Even if I took it and I said, I'm doing an olah sacrifice, a burnt offering from this, it still becomes a shlamim because Pesach, not in its proper time, is a shlamim. Amar Rabbi Yila, Tamad Rabbi Yochanan, what's his reason? Im minatzon korbanot lezevach hashlamim. What does that come to teach you? Kol shu zevach b'shlamim. Any kind of slaughtering of this animal will be a shlamim. It doesn't matter if you did it l'shem olah or not. Now they ask a question. Mishtaneh l'machshevet psul. Does this switch? Okay, now this is a little bit complicated to explain. There's something called pigul. If I have the wrong thought, I have the wrong thought about a korban. I'm going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong time. Like while I'm slaughtering it, I think I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, which is not allowed. If I do that, if I say I took this Pesach, I said I'm doing it, I slaughter it for the purposes of an olah. And at the same time, I have a thought that I'm going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong time. Is that a disqualified korban? Meaning it's no good to begin with, and therefore it doesn't even become pigul, because pigul is only when everything else is done properly, and you just messed up the pigul issue. And what does it mean to be pigul? Well, it means that if you eat the meat after, you're going to get karet. If it's just a disqualified korban, you don't get karet if you eat the meat. So it's very important to know, is it pigul or not? So what they're asking is, so they're now going to say, what exactly is this question? But if I have a machshevet psul, like a pigul, does it switch to become a shlamim that I did pigul on or not? So hechavida, what would be the case? Shachato l'shem olah, amanat l'zrok dama l'machal, mikom makom pasulu. If I slaughter it l'shem olah, in order to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, as we said, mikom makom pasulu, no matter what it's disqualified to, who cares? What's your question? In tamer, so here's the answer. In tamer, mishnah l'machshevet psul, pigul. If you say it is effective, that this psachim that I said I'm doing as an olah really became a shlamim, and then I piguled it, then it will be pigul. And then if I eat the meat, it'll be karet. But in tamer, you might say, and therefore it will be pasul. Okay, if you say it doesn't work, then meaning it's only effective if it's going to be good. It's not going to be valid. I'm not going to say that this Pesach that I said l'shem olah is actually going to work as a shlamim. It's only going to work if it's good. If it doesn't work, it's not effective, then there's no pigul, because the pigul never happened, because it was ineffective for other reasons. So that's the relevance of the question, but the Gemara doesn't give an answer. Lishmo v'shalo lishmo b'shar yamot hashana. So lishmo, this issue of lishmo and shalo lishmo, on other days of the year, Rabbi Bun bar Chia b'shem Shmuel bar Abba says, Mikevan she'en lo shem, na'aseh k'shochto lishmo v'shalo lishmo b'shtika v'hu kasher. So if you do it lishmo shalo lishmo on other days of the year, let's say I start slaughtering it with intent, it's going to be for Pesach on 10th of Nisan, not Pesach, not a day I can bring the korban. And then before I finish slaughtering, I think I'm going to do it as a shlamim. Does that work? So Rabbi Bun b'shem Chia bar Shmuel bar Abba says, Mikavan she'en lo shem, na'aseh k'shochto l'shmo v'shalo l'shmo b'shtika v'hu kasher. Since we basically view this, he basically compares it. He says, this is like slaughtering silently. Let's say I didn't say anything, and then I said I'm going to do it as a shlamim. That would for sure work. That would definitely be a shlamim. So this would be no different. Just who cares that I started with Pesach? I moved to shlamim. So now this comparative. So the response is, we don't really like this answer. Amar le im kenhu afilu shachato lishmo almanat lizrok damo shelo lishmo yaseh misha'ah rishona k'shochto lishmo v'shelo lishmo b'shtika v'yehei kasher. If you want to compare doing it lishmo and then switching to lo lishmo to doing it silently and then going to lo lishmo, I'll show you a case where that can't possibly be. Because what? If you slaughter lishmo, meaning for the Pesach, when it's not time for Pesach, in order to sprinkle the blood, you say in your mind, I'm going to sprinkle the blood as a shlamim, that for sure wouldn't work, right? But if you did the same thing and you slaughtered it for no reason, right? You didn't have any intent in your mind, and then you sprinkle, in order to sprinkle the blood as a shlamim, in other words, while you're slaughtering, you don't have any intent about the slaughter, what you're slaughtering it for, but you do have intent, you're going to sprinkle the blood for a shlamim, that of course is going to work. So if you're going to compare the two, you're going to say that the first case is going to work when you slaughtered it. The whole slaughtering happened l'shem Pesach, of course it's not going to work. That's a mistake because if I took a Pesach and I did L'Shem Pesach when it's not Pesach, that's for sure disqualified. Even if I have a thought, I'm going to be Zorek, I'm going to sprinkle the blood for a Shlamim. So you can't make these things, you can't use this comparison. To which Amar Rabbi Abba Mary, Man Omar B'shtika Kasher, One Emar B'shtika Pasul. Who says B'shtika it works? That case, you said, of course it can't compare to Shtika because Shtika would work. I don't think Shtika necessarily works. If it was a Pesachim and I slaughtered it without any, it was for the Pesach, and I slaughtered it without any intent on a day that you can't bring the Korban Pesach, and then in order to sprinkle the blood as a Shlamim, that won't necessarily work as a Shlamim. So therefore the comparison does stand and it's all fine. So there ends our daf. Okay, we're going to start next time with the Nazir case. I just want to try to look up this issue on Alda Amran, so just 1 second. Okay, so I see where I erred. This is how it works. Rabbi Yossi, going back to earlier in the daf, he says, Alda Aliel Abba Barba. On this, he questioned them. And all those questions about the drasha, because they said, and they brought the quote, and then he was the one who asked all those questions. He went back and said, oh, but what about the Ola? And what about this? And what about the Asham? That was all his questions. So that was the intro. So I confused it with the next case, which is where on this Rabbi Hanina disagreed with the rabbis. Here it was just he questioned the rabbis and he was the one asking all those questions. Okay, have a Chag Sameach and a Moadim L'Simcha, and we'll meet up after the Chag.